There are some images that just stick with you, and the fall of the Berlin Wall is definitely one of them. You have this massive concrete wall, this symbol of division, suddenly becoming a place of celebration, of unity. Its fall wasn't just about a physical barrier coming down. Nope. It was the dramatic, televised finale of a 40-year global standoff that pretty much held the entire world in its grip. So how did we get there? Let's dive in. Okay, so this is where it all comes to a head. November 9th, 1989. One city, one single night where decades of tension and fear and this huge ideological battle just came crashing down. The whole world was watching, just holding its breath as history was being made. And not by presidents or generals, but by everyday people. I mean, you can almost hear it, can't you? That sound. It wasn't just people chipping away at concrete. They were chipping away at an entire world order. They even had a nickname for these folks, Mauerspected, the wall woodpeckers. Every single one of them just hammering away for freedom, for a future that, honestly, just hours before seemed completely impossible. And that's the big question, right? How did a world that was basically frozen in place for 40 years get to this incredible breaking point? This didn't just happen out of the blue. It was the result of decades of pressure, of shifting politics, and in the end, a system that just couldn't hold itself together anymore. So to really understand the end, we've got to go back to the beginning. Right. So after the absolute devastation of World War II, the old world was just gone. And in its place, a brand new, starkly divided one popped up, setting the stage for what we now call the Cold War. So in one corner, you've got the United States, plexing its muscles with a powerful military and, at the time, the world's only atomic bomb. And in the other corner, the Soviet Union, with this massive sphere of influence all over Eastern Europe. Two giants, each with a totally different vision for how the world should work. And you can really see just how different those visions were right here. Under communism, you've got one political party, the state owns all the industry, and censorship is super strict. Then you look at capitalism, multiple parties, private ownership is the name of the game, all for profit, and you have freedom of speech. These weren't just boring economic theories, they were completely different ways of life. This image, wow, it just captures that division perfectly. Back in 1946, Winston Churchill gave a famous speech where he said an iron curtain had fallen across the continent. Now, it wasn't a physical wall yet, but it was a very, very real barrier separating the Soviet-controlled East from the democratic West. And this ideological divide, this war of ideas, it quickly turned into something way more terrifying. Both sides started building up their militaries like crazy, leading to an arms race that put the entire planet on edge. Just look at how fast this all happened. It's wild. In just 4 years, the US went from being the only nuclear power to having a rival. Then, just a few years after that, both sides developed the hydrogen bomb, a weapon literally thousands of times more powerful than the first atomic bombs. The stakes just kept getting higher and higher. And all this led to this truly terrifying logic called mutually assured destruction. You can't miss the acronym MAD. And it was. The basic idea was that since any nuclear attack would guarantee your own destruction in return, nobody would be crazy enough to actually start one. It kind of kept the peace, but it meant everyone was living with this constant, nagging threat of total annihilation. But nothing stays frozen forever. The Cold War wasn't just one long, deep freeze. By the 1970s, you start to see some cracks appearing in the ice, as both of the superpowers began to realize that something had to change. This period became known as détente, which is a French word that basically means relaxation. And for a little while, that tension that had defined the world for decades actually started to ease up. So, why the sudden thaw? Well, it was really a mix of practical needs and just plain old necessity. Both the US and the USSR were feeling the massive economic strain of this endless arms race. The US was tangled up in the incredibly costly Vietnam War, and the Soviet Union really wanted to improve the economy and living standards for its people. Bottom line, both sides needed a break. And you get these absolutely incredible moments of cooperation out of it, like this one, in 1975. While they were still bitter rivals down on Earth, American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts met up and shook hands in space. What a powerful symbol, right? It showed that even in the middle of the Cold War, a different kind of relationship was actually possible. Détente didn't last forever, though, and tensions spiked again in the early 80s. But then, in 1985, a new leader came to power in the Soviet Union who would, maybe unintentionally, set the stage for the final collapse, Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev came in with two radical new policies. The first was glasnost, which means openness. A good way to remember it is to think of glass, like making the government more transparent. The second was perestroika, or restructuring, which was all about overhauling the creaky old Soviet economy. But here's the ultimate irony. Gorbachev's big reforms weren't meant to destroy the Soviet Union. They were meant to save it. Instead, they basically opened a floodgate. Glasnost, openness, led to a tidal wave of criticism. Perestroika, restructuring, just exposed how deep the economic problems really were. And all across Eastern Europe, people saw their chance and started demanding more and more freedom. And that brings us right back to where we started, that chilly November night in Berlin. That spirit of change that Gorbachev had accidentally unleashed reached a boiling point. The calls for freedom weren't just whispers anymore. They were shouts, echoing across the city, backed by the sound of all those hammers and chisels. Once the wall fell, the end came so fast. It was like the first domino in a long line. Within a year, Germany was one country again. And just a year after that, the superpower that had defined half of the 20th century, the Soviet Union, just ceased to exist. Gone. So the fall of the wall was the symbolic end of this massive global conflict. It totally reshaped the world map and kicked off a whole new era. But it also left us with this big, lingering question. The Cold War, as we knew it, was over. But did that dynamic of global power and rivalry ever really go away? Or did it just change its clothes?